room over the course of just 3 months. The fate of an entire continent was decided. The year was 1884. The place, Berlin, Germany. Around a table sat men in tailored suits, smoking cigars, sipping wine, and drawing lines across maps with rulers and pencils.
None of them had ever set foot in the heart of Africa. None of them spoke the languages of the people whose lands they were dividing. And yet, with a stroke of a pen, they carved up kingdoms that had stood for centuries. They split families, erased borders, and declared ownership over lands they had never seen. By the time the conference ended, almost the entire African continent had been handed over to European powers. No African leader was invited, no African voice was heard. This is the story of the Scramble for Africa, a race so ruthless, so rapid, and so devastating that it changed the course of history forever. Within just 3 decades, over 90% of Africa fell under European control. But how did it happen? Why did it happen? And what were the Africans doing while their land was being stolen from under them? Stay with us, because this is not just a story of conquest. It's a story of resistance, survival, and a legacy that still shapes Africa today. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your host, and today we are diving deep into one of the most transformative and tragic periods in African history, the Scramble for Africa.
Between 1881 and 1914, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain raced to claim African territories. They called it exploration and civilization. But in reality, it was colonization, exploitation, domination. In this documentary, we will walk through the entire timeline of the Scramble. We'll explore the economic greed, the political rivalries, and the technological advantages that made this conquest possible. We'll introduce you to the African kingdoms and leaders who resisted, some successfully, others tragically, and we'll uncover the hidden truths, the secret deals, the manufactured borders, and the long-lasting scars left on the African continent. This story begins in the late 1800s, but its roots stretch back centuries. To understand the Scramble, we must first understand what Africa looked like before the Europeans arrived in full force. We must understand the wealth, the power, and the complexity of African societies that many history books choose to ignore. So let's go back to a time when Africa was not a dark continent, but a land of thriving civilizations, ancient trade routes, and independent kingdoms. Let's begin. Before European powers descended upon Africa with their guns and treaties, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and political systems. From the Sahara to the Cape, Africa was far from the uncivilized wilderness that European propaganda later portrayed. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire controlled rich gold mines and commanded a powerful military. The Sokoto Caliphate stretched across what is now northern Nigeria, governing millions under Islamic law. In East Africa, the Sultanate of Zanzibar dominated the Indian Ocean trade, dealing in ivory, spices, and textiles. In Southern Africa, the Zulu Kingdom had transformed into a formidable military state under the leadership of King Shaka. They were not primitive tribes waiting to be discovered. These were organized states with courts, armies, economies, and diplomatic relations with one another. They traded with the Middle East, India, and even China long before Europeans claimed to have opened Africa to the world. But by the mid-1800s, Europe was changing. And with that change came a hunger, an insatiable hunger for resources, markets, and power. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s, transformed Europe. Factories needed raw materials, cotton, rubber, palm oil, metals, and minerals. European industries needed new markets to sell their manufactured goods, and European nations needed prestige, territories that would prove their dominance on the world stage. At the same time, new technologies gave Europeans unprecedented advantages. Steamships could navigate Africa's rivers. The telegraph allowed instant communication across continents. Railways could transport troops and goods deep into the interior. And perhaps most importantly, the Maxim machine gun, the first fully automatic weapon, gave European soldiers the ability to mow down African warriors armed with spears and outdated muskets. One British officer infamously summarized the imbalance. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. But technology alone doesn't explain the scramble. There was also a shift in European attitudes. By the 1880s, a dangerous idea had taken hold in Europe: the belief in racial superiority. Pseudoscientific theories claimed that Europeans were biologically and culturally superior to Africans. This ideology was used to justify conquest, enslavement, and exploitation. It was called the white man's burden, the notion that Europeans had a moral duty to civilize Africa. Christian missionaries arrived in Africa, genuinely believing they were saving souls. But behind them came soldiers, merchants, and administrators who saw Africa as a treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. Even before the official scramble began, European powers had established coastal footholds. The Portuguese controlled Angola and Mozambique. The British held the Cape Colony in South Africa and trading posts in West Africa. The French had expanded their influence in Algeria and Senegal. But these were still small, scattered territories. Everything was about to change. The man who lit the fuse of the scramble was not a soldier or a statesman. He was a king with a private ambition, King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold was obsessed with acquiring a colony. Belgium was a small country, and Leopold envied the vast empires of Britain and France. So he turned his eyes to Central Africa, specifically the Congo Basin, a massive region rich in ivory, rubber, and timber. But Leopold was cunning. He didn't invade the Congo as a national conquest. Instead, he hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to travel through the Congo, signing treaties with local chiefs. These treaties, written in languages the chiefs couldn't read, supposedly granted Leopold personal control over their lands. In 1885, the Congo Free State was born, not as a Belgian colony, but as Leopold's private property. He ruled it like a corporate plantation, extracting wealth through forced labor, mutilation, and mass murder. Millions of Congolese people died under his brutal regime, but Leopold's actions did something else. They set off alarm bells across Europe. If Belgium, a tiny nation, could claim the heart of Africa, what was stopping Britain, France, and Germany from doing the same? The race was on. Let's meet the players in this imperial game. Britain was the dominant global power, controlling the seas and vast territories in Asia and the Americas. In Africa, Britain wanted to secure a continuous chain of territories from Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south, a vision championed by the imperialist Cecil Rhodes. France sought to build a horizontal empire across Africa, stretching from Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. French leaders saw African colonies as essential to maintaining France's status as a great power. Germany, newly unified under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, arrived late to the imperial stage. But Bismarck saw colonies as useful bargaining chips in European diplomacy. Germany claimed Togoland, Cameroon, Namibia, and Tanganyika. Portugal, once the dominant European power in Africa, clung desperately to Angola and Mozambique, hoping to connect them with a transcontinental corridor. Italy, also newly unified, sought colonies to rival the other European powers. Italy invaded Ethiopia and Somalia with disastrous results. Belgium, under King Leopold II, controlled the Congo through ruthless exploitation. Spain held small territories in Western Sahara and Equatorial Guinea. These nations saw Africa as a chessboard. African lives were merely pawns. But Africa was not a passive victim. Across the continent, leaders and kingdoms fought back with intelligence, diplomacy, and military might. Menelik II of Ethiopia was perhaps the most successful. He modernized his army, imported European weapons, and skillfully played European powers against one another. In 1896, his forces defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa, preserving Ethiopia's independence. Samori Ture, the founder of the Wasulu Empire in West Africa, waged a brilliant guerrilla war against the French for nearly 20 years. He adapted his tactics, built his own weapons factories, and moved his entire kingdom to avoid capture. Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of the Ashanti Empire, led a rebellion against British rule in 1900. Though ultimately defeated, her courage became a symbol of resistance. The Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Cetshwayo, fought fiercely against British invasion. At the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, Zulu warriors inflicted one of the worst defeats ever suffered by a modern European army. The Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, led a religious uprising in Sudan, defeating Egyptian and British forces and establishing an independent Islamic state that lasted over a decade. These were not helpless victims. These were strategic, determined leaders who understood the threat they faced and fought with everything they had. But they faced overwhelming odds. For most of the 19th century, European control in Africa was limited to coastal regions. The interior, what Europeans called Darkest Africa, remained largely unknown to them. Disease, difficult terrain, and strong African kingdoms kept Europeans at bay. But European explorers began mapping Africa's rivers and lakes. David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and others trekked through the continent, sending back reports of vast resources and uncivilized peoples in need of salvation. These explorers were celebrated as heroes in Europe, but they were also scouts, preparing the way for conquest. By the 1870s, European traders and missionaries had established small outposts. Tensions began to rise as European powers competed for influence. Then came the trigger: Leopold's Congo scheme, and with it the Berlin Conference. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. The conference was organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and was officially called the Congo Conference. The stated purpose: to regulate European colonization and trade in Africa, prevent conflicts between European powers, and promote civilization on the continent. The real purpose: to divide Africa among themselves without going to war. No African representatives were invited, not a single one. Over 3 months, European diplomats negotiated, argued, and bargained. They drew borders on maps using rivers, mountains, and arbitrary lines of longitude and latitude. They ignored ethnic groups, kingdoms, and historical territories. The conference established several key principles. 1. Effective occupation. A European power could only claim a territory if it could prove effective control through administration and military presence. 2. Free trade zones. Certain regions like the Congo Basin were declared free trade zones open to all European merchants. 3. Notification. Any nation claiming new African territory had to notify the others to avoid conflict. The result? Africa was carved up like a birthday cake. Britain took the largest share, France took the second largest, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain divided the rest. By the time the conference ended in February 1885, the stage was set for the most rapid and brutal phase of colonization in human history. With the rules established, European powers moved swiftly. Britain expanded aggressively in southern, eastern, and western Africa. Cecil Rhodes, backed by the British South Africa Company, pushed into what would become Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. British forces invaded Egypt in 1882 and gradually extended control up the Nile into Sudan. France launched military campaigns across West and Central Africa. French forces defeated the Tukulor Empire, conquered the kingdoms of Dahomey and Borg, and pushed into the Sahara and Sahel regions. Germany claimed Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, Tanganyika, and German Southwest Africa, Namibia. German colonial rule was marked by extreme violence, including the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia. Portugal solidified its hold on Angola and Mozambique, brutally suppressing local resistance. Italy attempted to invade Ethiopia in 1895 but was humiliated at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a stunning victory for Emperor Menelik II that preserved Ethiopian independence. Belgium, or rather King Leopold, personally tightened his grip on the Congo. Forced labor camps, mutilations, and mass killings turned the Congo into a death zone. Millions died. But Africans did not surrender quietly. Samori Ture fought a mobile guerrilla war against the French. He retreated, regrouped, and struck back. For 16 years, he resisted French expansion, moving his entire empire eastward and even establishing diplomatic relations with the British. He was finally captured in 1898. The Ashanti Empire in modern-day Ghana resisted British invasion multiple times. The British finally defeated the Ashanti in 1900, but only after fierce battles and the courageous leadership of Queen Mother Yaa Asantewa. The Zulu kingdom fought the British in a series of wars. At Isandowana in 1879, Zulu warriors killed over 1,300 British soldiers in one of the most shocking defeats in British military history. But superior British firepower eventually overwhelmed the Zulu. The Mahdi's forces in Sudan defeated an Egyptian-British army led by General Charles Gordon in 1885. The Mahdi state survived until 1898, when British forces armed with machine guns massacred thousands at the Battle of Omdurman. In German East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, saw diverse ethnic groups unite against German rule. The Germans responded with a scorched earth policy, burning villages and poisoning water sources. Over 300,000 Africans died. Each resistance movement was met with overwhelming violence. European powers used starvation, disease, and massacres to crush opposition. By 1900, the map of Africa had been almost entirely redrawn. Only two nations remained independent: Ethiopia and Liberia. European colonial administrations began to establish control. They built railways to extract resources. They imposed taxes to force Africans into wage labor. They divided ethnic groups and imposed foreign languages, laws, and customs. Borders drawn in Berlin cut through kingdoms, splitting families and communities. The Yoruba people found themselves divided between British Nigeria and French Dahomey. The Somali people were split among British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Ethiopia. The Congo people found themselves on opposite sides of the Congo River under Belgian and French rule. These artificial borders ignored centuries of history, culture, and identity. They would become sources of conflict for generations to come. Meanwhile, European powers competed for dominance. Britain and France nearly went to war over a remote outpost in Sudan in 1898 during the Fashoda incident. Tensions between European empires grew. But the scramble itself was over. By 1914, the eve of World War I, Africa had been conquered. One of the great lies of the scramble was the idea that Africa was an empty land waiting to be filled. European maps often labeled vast regions as unexplored or uninhabited. But these lands were not empty. They were home to millions of people with complex societies, trade networks, and governance systems. The myth of emptiness was used to justify theft. Not all Africans resisted European conquest. Some African leaders, traders, and soldiers collaborated with the European powers either out of self-interest, coercion, or the belief that cooperation would protect their people. European colonial armies relied heavily on African soldiers. The French used Senegalese tirailleurs. The British recruited from Kenya, Uganda, and West Africa. Africans fought Africans in wars orchestrated by Europeans. This collaboration was often born of desperation. Some leaders believed that allying with Europeans would protect them from rival African kingdoms. Others were tricked or bribed, but their cooperation helped European powers conquer the continent. The violence of the scramble was often hidden from European publics. Newspapers celebrated colonial expansion as a civilizing mission, but the reality was brutal. In the Congo, King Leopold's agents forced villagers to harvest rubber under threat of mutilation or death. Hands were cut off as punishment for failing to meet quotas. Conservative estimates suggest that 10 million Congolese people died under Leopold's rule. In Namibia, German forces exterminated the Herero and Nama peoples in what is now recognized as the first genocide of the 20th century. Survivors were driven into the desert to die of thirst. In Algeria, French colonial forces used mass killings, forced displacement, and land confiscation to crush resistance. These atrocities were not anomalies, they were the norm. The scramble was fundamentally about profit. European companies extracted raw materials, gold, diamonds, rubber, ivory, palm oil, while forcing Africans into unpaid or underpaid labor. Railways were built not to benefit Africans, but to transport goods from the interior to ports for export to Europe. Taxes were imposed to force Africans to work in mines and plantations. Traditional economies were destroyed. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled European development, but Africa itself was impoverished. European colonizers didn't just steal land and resources, they attempted to erase African culture. Indigenous languages were banned in schools, African religions were suppressed in favor of Christianity. Traditional governance systems were replaced by foreign administrators. African history was rewritten, portraying pre-colonial Africa as backward and primitive. Generations of Africans grew up believing their own cultures were inferior. The psychological damage of colonialism was as deep as the economic exploitation. The borders drawn during the scramble have caused decades of conflict. Ethnic groups that once lived together were split apart. Rival groups that had historically fought were forced into the same colony. When African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, they inherited these colonial borders. Leaders faced the choice: redraw the borders or keep them. Most chose to keep them, fearing that changing borders would. The scramble laid the foundation for Africa's economic struggles. Colonial economies were designed to extract resources for Europe, not to develop Africa itself. Railways ran from mines to ports, not between African cities. Education systems trained Africans to be clerks and laborers, not engineers and entrepreneurs. Industries were banned to prevent competition with European manufacturers. When African nations gained independence, they inherited economies dependent on exporting raw materials. This dependency continues today. Colonial powers often used the strategy of divide and rule. They favored certain ethnic groups over others, creating hierarchies and resentments. In Rwanda, Belgian colonizers classified people as Hutu or Tutsi based on pseudoscientific criteria. This division contributed to the 1994 genocide. In Nigeria, British colonizers governed the North and South differently, fostering regional tensions that persist. Across Africa, ethnic conflicts rooted in colonial manipulation continue to destabilize nations. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the scramble is psychological. Generations of Africans were taught that their cultures, languages, and histories were inferior. Colonial education systems glorified European civilization while erasing African achievements. Even today, many African countries use European languages as official languages. Western standards of beauty, success, and progress are often seen as superior. Overcoming this internalized oppression remains one of Africa's greatest challenges. But the scramble also planted the seeds of resistance. African intellectuals, inspired by anti-colonial movements around the world, began organizing for independence. Pan-Africanism, a movement promoting unity among African peoples, emerged in response to colonialism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Julius Nyerere drew inspiration from the resistance of figures like Samori Ture, Menelik II, and Ya Asantewa. The scramble may have conquered Africa, but it could not break the African spirit. The scramble for Africa was not inevitable. It was a choice made by European leaders, driven by greed, ambition, and racism. In just over 3 decades, an entire continent was stolen. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were destroyed. Millions of lives were lost. Cultures were erased. And the effects of that theft are still felt today. But the scramble also teaches us about resilience. African leaders and peoples fought back with everything they had. Some won battles, some won temporary victories, and Ethiopia won something even greater, lasting independence. The story of the scramble is a reminder that history is not made by destiny. It is made by people, by their decisions, their actions, and their choices. Africa before colonialism was not primitive. It was complex, sophisticated, and dynamic. The narrative that Europeans civilized Africa is a lie designed to justify theft and violence. Today, as African nations continue to reckon with the legacy of colonialism, the lessons of the scramble remain urgent. The fight for true independence, economic, political, and cultural, is ongoing. The scramble may have ended in 1914, but its consequences are still unfolding. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most devastating periods in African history. The scramble for Africa was not just a historical event, it was a turning point that reshaped the world. Understanding it is essential to understanding modern Africa and the modern world. If this documentary opened your eyes, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We dive deep into the hidden histories of Africa, the stories that textbooks leave out. In our next episode, we'll explore the Haitian Revolution and its impact on African liberation movements. You won't want to miss it. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about the scramble for Africa? What part of this story do you want to learn more about? Remember, History is not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget, Africa's story is far from over. This is Africa Hidden History. Peace. Mbeki pushed for the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, an economic plan that promised African-led development in exchange for improved governance. While Gaddafi threw money at problems, Mbeki negotiated structures and institutions. Together, these two very different leaders would shape the African Union, one providing resources and revolutionary energy, the other providing legitimacy and diplomatic skill. Not all key players were individuals, some were groups. The frontline states, nations like Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana had fought together against colonialism and apartheid. They had experience cooperating across borders for liberation. They understood that Africa's problems required African solutions. Leaders like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere had been champions of Pan-Africanism since the 1960s. Though Nyerere had retired by 2002, his influence lived on. He had proven that African unity wasn't just theoretical, it could be practical, especially in the face of common enemies. But not everyone believed in the African Union dream. Some leaders saw it as a threat to their power. Others saw it as an expensive distraction from real problems. Nations like Nigeria and Egypt, giants of African politics, worried about losing influence in a united structure. Smaller nations feared being dominated by larger, wealthier neighbors. Outside Africa, Western powers watched nervously. A truly united Africa could challenge the post-colonial economic order. It could control its own resources, set its own terms, resist external manipulation. France, Britain, and the United States had spent decades maintaining influence through bilateral relationships with individual African nations. A strong African Union could change everything. The formation of the AU wasn't just an internal African affair. It was geopolitics, a power struggle over who would control Africa's future. To understand why the African Union was necessary, we must understand why the OAU failed. The Organization of African Unity began with high hopes. Its charter promised solidarity and coordination, but almost immediately cracks appeared. In 1967, the Biafran War erupted in Nigeria. The southeastern region attempted to secede, leading to a brutal 3-year conflict that killed over 1 million people, mostly through starvation. The OAU did nothing. Its principle of non-interference meant it couldn't take sides, couldn't intervene, couldn't save lives. In Uganda, Idi Amin launched one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships in the 1970s. He killed an estimated 300,000 people. The OAU remained silent. Why? Because Amin was a head of state, and the OAU protected heads of state, no matter their crimes. In 1994, Rwanda descended into genocide. In just 100 days, approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered. The OAU issued statements but took no action. It had no mechanisms for intervention, no peacekeeping forces, no authority to stop member states from committing atrocities. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Crisis emerges, OAU discusses, nothing happens. Critics called it the dictator's club. Leaders who committed human rights abuses in their own countries were welcomed at OAU summits. The organization seemed more interested in protecting sovereignty than protecting people. But the 1990s brought transformation. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The artificial divisions that had defined African politics for decades, capitalist versus communist, East versus West, suddenly meant nothing. At the same time, a new generation of African leaders emerged. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, who brought moral authority. Leaders like Uganda's Yoweri Museveni and Ethiopia's Meles Zenawi, who talked about self-reliance and good governance. They looked at the OAU and saw failure. They asked hard questions. Why can't we stop wars? Why can't we promote democracy? Why are we still so dependent on foreign aid and foreign intervention? In 1999, the OAU finally acknowledged its own inadequacy. At the Algiers summit, African leaders admitted that the organization needed fundamental reform. The world was changing. Africa needed to change with it. Enter Muammar Gaddafi. In September 1999, Gaddafi hosted an extraordinary OAU summit in Sirte, Libya. This wasn't a regular meeting, it was a call to revolution. Gaddafi made his case. The OAU is broken, it has failed to prevent conflicts, failed to promote development, failed to give Africa a voice in global affairs. He proposed something radical. Dissolve the OAU and create a new organization, a United States of Africa with supranational powers, a continental government, a single military, one economic union. The proposal shocked many leaders. It was Nkrumah's dream reborn, but 40 years later, and from a controversial messenger. Some leaders were enthusiastic, others were horrified, but everyone agreed on one thing. The status quo wasn't working. The Sirte Declaration was adopted. It called for the establishment of an African Union, but the details were left vague. What powers would it have? How would it be structured? Would it respect sovereignty or override it? The debate had begun. Between 1999 and 2001, African diplomats worked to hammer out the details. Two visions competed. Gaddafi's vision, strong central authority, immediate political integration, United States of Africa. Mbeki and others' vision, gradual integration, focus on economic development, respect for sovereignty with limited exceptions. The negotiations were intense. Smaller nations feared domination. Larger nations feared losing control. Some leaders genuinely believed in unity. Others saw it as a way to maintain their own power with a new institutional shield. Compromises were made. The African Union would be stronger than the OAU. It would have the right to intervene in grave circumstances like genocide, but it wouldn't be a superstate. Nations would retain sovereignty. It would promote economic integration through the African Economic Community, but it wouldn't force political union. It would have a Peace and Security Council to address conflicts, but interventions would require consensus. In July 2000 in Lomé, Togo, the Constitutive Act of the African Union was adopted. 49 countries signed it. 1 year later, after two-thirds had ratified it, it entered into force. The African Union was real. July 9th, 2002, Durban, South Africa. The world watched as the Organization of African Unity held its final summit. That evening, it would officially dissolve. In its place, the African Union would be born. The symbolism was powerful. South Africa, once the continent's shame, the last bastion of white minority rule, was now its shining hope. Nelson Mandela, though retired, attended. Thabo Mbeki, as host, welcomed leaders from across the continent. 53 nations were represented, from tiny island nations like Seychelles to continental giants like Nigeria and Egypt, from democracies to dictatorships, from the wealthiest to the poorest. At midnight, the OAU banner was lowered. The AU flag, green with a golden map of Africa surrounded by stars, was raised. Speeches were made. Gaddafi called it Africa's moment. Mbeki spoke of renaissance and renewal. Alpha Oumar Konaré of Mali became the AU's first chairperson. But beneath the celebration, questions lingered. Would this new organization be different? Could Africa truly unite? Or was this just the OAU with a new name? The African Union was immediately tested. In 2003, conflict erupted in Darfur, Sudan. The Sudanese government launched a campaign of violence against African ethnic groups. Hundreds of thousands died. The AU faced its first major crisis. Unlike the OAU, the AU acted. It deployed the African Union mission in Sudan amidst 7,000 peacekeepers sent to protect civilians. For the first time, African soldiers were intervening in an African conflict under African command. But IME struggled. Underfunded, under-equipped, and understaffed, the mission couldn't stop the violence. Eventually, the United Nations took over. The Darfur intervention showed both the AU's ambition and its limitations. It wanted to solve African problems with African solutions, but without sufficient resources, political will, or military capacity, it couldn't. Other challenges emerged. Burundi descended into civil war. The AU deployed peacekeepers, again underfunded and overwhelmed. Togo experienced a constitutional crisis. The AU suspended Togo until democratic order was restored, a move the OAU never would have made. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe presided over economic collapse and political violence. The AU issued statements but took no real action, revealing that old habits died hard. While peacekeeping grabbed headlines, the real work of the AU happened in meeting rooms and policy documents. The African Union wasn't just one institution, it was a system. The assembly of heads of state and government, the supreme decision-making body, the Executive Council of Foreign Ministers implementing decisions, the Pan-African Parliament representing Africa's people, though with limited powers, the Peace and Security Council responsible for conflict prevention and intervention, the African Court on Human and People's Rights enforcing human rights standards, the African Union Commission, the administrative bureaucracy running day-to-day operations, regional economic communities building blocks for continental integration. Each institution faced challenges. The Pan-African Parliament struggled with legitimacy because most members were appointed, not elected. The Peace and Security Council lacked funding for its ambitious mandate. The Commission in Addis Ababa was plagued by bureaucracy and inefficiency, but slowly structures took shape. Protocols were signed, norms were established. The African Union began developing its own identity, separate from the Organization of African Unity's legacy. One of the AU's most ambitious goals was economic integration. Africa in 2002 was economically fragmented. 53 currencies, 53 sets of trade regulations, 53 different customs systems. Moving goods across African borders was often harder than shipping them to Europe. The AU inherited the African Economic Community framework from the OAU, which envisioned 6 stages of integration culminating in a single African common market by 2028.
Een aantrekkend lage-drukgebied blijft het voorlopig nog wel even wisselvallig weer. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world
Is het gelukt?
needs now
Wat geweldig, schat.
Met Hansie op vakantie.
what the world needs now is love, sweet love.
En wat vinden jullie ervan?
Ja, perfect.
Ja, bijna. Kunnen alleen de pootjes in een andere kleur? En zo'n eiland, kan dat daar ook? Kan hier opbergruimte onder? En daar ook? En zo'n relaxfunctie, kan dat ook? En pocketvering, kiezen we dan pocketvering of traagschuim? En kan er ook zo'n extra armleuning bij? Geen probleem.
Echt?
Pronto wonen.
Deal?
Precies
Ja.
zoals jij het wil.
This sleek modern train connects major cities in Kenya. Funded largely by China, the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway began operations in 2017. From gleaming railways to state-of-the-art highways, ports and power plants, Chinese investments have reshaped the African landscape. Like Kenya's landmark railway, many of these projects were financed by Chinese entities, participating in Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Since this initiative to improve connectivity and cooperation was launched in 2013, it has grown rapidly across the African continent.
53 out of 54 African countries have a memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road Initiative.
But China's current economic slowdown, coupled with the prospect of Western trade restrictions and the uncertainties posed by a new US administration, have prompted a recalibration of economic ties between China and African nations. China's commitment to Africa was on full display in early 2025, when Foreign Minister Wang Yi embarked on a work visit to the continent.
The foreign minister will always make a trip to the African continent at the beginning of the year, and they will usually pick between 4 and 5 countries to go to. It's a tradition that's been ongoing for about 35 years.
In 2025, Wang visited Namibia, the Republic of Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. In mineral-rich Namibia, he emphasized the nation's mutually beneficial economic ties.
非常好的前景。那么我们之间首先是政治上是相互信任的，同时我们经济是高度互补的。最重要的是，中国有坚定的加强中非友好的政策和信念。
Wang's visit was